So hello, welcome to the UAS Ketchikan Campus Library. I'm Kathy Bowling and that's Alana Clark. As I say every time, you can get a library card here at UAS Ketchikan, and it gives you access not only to our collection, and we are an academic library, so our collection is fairly different from the public library. It also gives you access to over 3 million other titles across the state because we belong to the Alaska Library Catalog. So once you get your card with your number and you tell us your magic 8-digit PIN, we'll put it in the system. Then when you go into our catalog and search a topic, you can search across the state. You put in your library card number and your PIN, and you can place a hold on that item. They will mail it to us, and we call you up or email you. You come and check it out because it's a library, it's free, and then bring it back to us when it's due, and then we send it back. So it's really an amazing opportunity to have access to library catalogs across the state. So I would like to introduce Dr. Taylor Rose. Dr. Rose got his bachelor's in anthropology and political science at the University of Florida, his master's in history at Portland State, and his PhD in history at Yale University. His research interests are the U.S. West, environmental history, Native American history, infrastructure, military geographies, and mining. And spring registration is open. And Dr. Rose will be teaching world history too, history of the U.S. too, and infrastructure and environment in the U.S. And so you can register for any or all those classes or any number of classes here at UAS. And so I'd like you to welcome Dr. Rose.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Kathy, for that nice introduction. Can everyone in the back hear me all right? Good to go? Okay, cool. Well, I'm just gonna, okay, cool. Okay, so for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Taylor. So I'm assistant professor of history here at UAS, as Kathy just said, and I just started here this fall. So my wife and I moved here from New Haven, Connecticut, where I was finishing my PhD, and she was working in a cancer research lab. We met in Portland, Oregon many years ago before I dragged her out east. But we're excited to be back on the West Coast, especially in such a unique and special place like Ketchikan. And although she couldn't be here tonight, we're both looking forward to meeting all of you, either this evening or as we get settled into the community a little bit more. So here at UAS Ketchikan, like Kathy just said, I teach history. I teach classes in both world and US history. And the topic that I'll be talking about tonight, the history of this buzzword that you may have heard or read about in the past few years, critical minerals, has implications in both global and domestic settings. But the main focus of my research, also as Kathy just said, is the US West in the late 19th century and the 20th century. So that's primarily what you're going to be hearing about this evening, wherever your interests may lie. Whether or not you consider Alaska part of the U.S. West, a topic which I've learned this semester apparently generates some degree of controversy among Alaskans. I think you'll find many resonances between Nevada's militarized mining history and that of our state up here. And I say this only because as I was kind of putting the finishing touches on this presentation the other night and thinking about how to introduce it in a way that made the history of Nevada seem relevant to Alaskans, I realized that I actually kind of didn't really need to do all that much. Just this past week, I found myself reading an article about how proposals to open, reopen, or expand mines in British Columbia threatened downstream communities, ecosystems, and fisheries in coastal Southeast Alaska. So Tlingit and Haida community members are quoted in this article from the Washington Post, which I think was actually reprinted in the Anchorage Daily News as well. They're saying very similar things to the Northern Paiute and Western Shoshone community members that I'll be quoting in my story today, namely about the anticipated or possible effects of mining, for any number of minerals that suddenly are in high demand due to the growth in electric vehicle manufacturing. The price of many of these minerals, as you may know, from lithium to cobalt to copper and even gold to a certain extent, have fluctuated dramatically in just the past few years, but on the whole have been steadily increasing, which has had the effect of incentivizing, of course, new projects, often in such remote mountainous regions. Despite their differences, thus, Alaska and Nevada, I think, have a lot in common. So I invite you to look out for more commonalities tonight between Alaska and Nevada as I give my talk. I know that just since moving here, I've noticed a lot myself, from kind of the dependency on aviation to debates over tourism to the heavy presence of the armed forces, both in terms of active duty service member residents or in-state veteran populations, and in terms, of course, of national defense infrastructure within Alaska's territory. So some of the largest military installations, as you may know, particularly testing and training ranges, are located in Alaska and Nevada. A reality that, as I've learned in my research, has a lot to do with the enormous extent of federal lands in each state and a history of proposals by local, state, and federal leaders to make something of those quote unquote wastelands, as they're often described. To kind of find a way to make the land generate an income for remote rural communities, not unlike natural resource industries such as timber, ranching, and mining. And so what I try to show in my work is that historically and presently, militarization and extraction have always been kind of inextricably connected with one another. So I invite you to ask questions once we get to the end of the talk, with just one or two caveats. The first is that I'm not an Alaska expert, despite what I just said about noticing commonalities with past and present Nevada. I'm excited to learn more, but if you've got specific examples that you want to run by me, either historical or ongoing, I may need just a little bit of a rundown or a refresher. The other caveat is just that I'm a historian, not a natural resources economist, nor a mining expert, nor an attorney or anything like that. And I'm certainly neither a reporter on the critical minerals scene at the moment, nor am I someone with the ability to forecast what's going to happen with the EV market over the next, let's say, 4 years. I wish I knew more, but between the downturn in electric vehicle sales this past year and all the uncertainty around a new presidential administration and a new Congress, it's hard to say where things are heading. My research and reading is really kind of up to date through the early summer of this past year. Just for reference, that's when my wife and I made the big move here, and followed soon thereafter by my being consumed with teaching. So ask me again maybe a year or two from now, and I'll have more to say. But for now, I'm keeping my eye on both Nevada and Alaska for the time being. With that being said, so I'd like to introduce you to my research today by focusing on a place that many Americans might consider to be the middle of nowhere. A flyover country, quote unquote, of supposedly desert wastelands, empty except for sand, sagebrush, and perhaps a few isolated communities in the rugged interior of the US West. But to residents of the Quinn River Valley in northern Nevada's Humboldt County, it's home, and in many ways, it's the center of the world. This is particularly the case for locals who claim indigenous ancestry in the Numu, or Northern Paiute, and Niuwa, or Western Shoshone tribal nations, which have occupied this and other corners of the Great Basin, as they would tell you, since time immemorial. So to be more specific, I want to zoom in on this place in the upper reaches of the Quinn River watershed, a closed desert basin like many across Nevada. The Quinn eventually drains into the Black Rock Desert, perhaps most famous for hosting the Burning Man Festival, if you're familiar. But up the drainage, located on a saddle along a low ridgeline jutting out into the middle of the watershed, is what's called Thacker Pass, or as Numu speakers call it, Pahimaha. Now, if you've never heard of the battle playing out at Thacker Pass over the past, present, and future of natural resource extraction on contested native lands, today I want to show you why I think you should. So, far from being a worthless wasteland, powerful actors in government and industry now claim that access to untapped deposits of the so-called critical mineral lithium at Thacker Pass is essential to solving the climate crisis. A soft silvery metal found in significant quantities in only a handful of locations across the globe, lithium is the key component in lithium-ion batteries used in electric vehicle manufacturing. Given the urgent need to develop a domestic EV supply chain for the clean energy revolution, lithium is thus marketed as critical to sustainability and indeed the political and economic security of the United States in the 21st century. This push for lithium, of course, is new. Thacker Pass first saw significant attention in the 2010s following innovations in battery technology and rising demand for EVs among consumers. But to Numu land defenders who have been working to stop lithium development at Thacker Pass for the past few years, the extractive boom is in fact nothing new. For tribal members at Fort McDermott Reservation and the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, it evokes a long, turbulent, and often violent history of mining, militarization, and colonial dispossession, as well as efforts by Paiute people and groups like Protect Thacker Pass to resist encroachment on what they consider to be sacred lands. So according to oral tradition and documentary evidence, Pahimaha, which you see here, is the site of a September 1865 massacre in which at least 31 Paiutes, many of them women and children, were killed in the early morning hours by an American militia of ranchers, miners, and settler leaders from nearby communities. The militia was sanctioned and in effect deputized by Army officials at nearby Fort McDermott, which was a cavalry post before it became an Indian reservation in 1889, roughly about 30 miles northeast of Thacker Pass. So at the time, in the late summer of 1865, only a month after it was built to keep the peace among the region's booming gold and silver mining districts, Fort McDermott was short-staffed due to the exigencies of the Civil War, which had ended just 4 months prior. At the confluence of extraction, settlement, and military infrastructure development, which is what the fort was, Pahimaha thus became home to the spirits of Paiute ancestors and perhaps the remains of their bodies as well. The name Pahimaha actually translates to rotten moon in the Numu language, an image that their descendants associate with that traumatic morning. So as part of my current book project, which is entitled Battleborn, Nevada and the Militarized West, I've explored the history of Thacker Pass and other sites of so-called critical mineral extraction across the Intermountain West from the 1850s really to the present. Looking beyond lithium to a variety of mineral resources once considered critical, from titanium to magnesium to copper, silver, and gold, I followed research leads cited by Protect Thacker Pass and pursued critical questions raised by similar native land rights movements formed over the past century and a half in what we now call Nevada. And what I found is that it's really impossible to narrate the history of the US West and really modern American history more broadly without understanding the relationship between natural resource extraction, violence against Native Americans, and the militarized language, legal frameworks, and infrastructure development initiatives associated with warfare. At the same time, I've also seen how from the beginning, Paiutes, Shoshones, and other indigenous people have been resisting development on their homelands, much like Protect Thacker Pass is doing today. Thus, even in the case of lithium, critical to an ostensibly peaceful competition for global supremacy, the legacies of conquest and conflict are really an unavoidable part of that story. So by tracing the story of Thacker Pass as a case study of what I refer to as the militarized West, we can see how contemporary infrastructure development projects that are described as clean and green sometimes replicate the dynamics of the past in ways that reveal their essentially colonial nature. Moreover, by placing critical mineral mining in the context of a state like Nevada, which calls itself battle-born for its origins during the Civil War, and since the mid 20th century, like I said, has hosted some of the largest military installations in the country, we can see how extraction and militarization have always gone hand in hand, from Fort McDermott to the Nevada test site. So for the next half hour or so, I'm going to take you on kind of a whirlwind tour of critical mineral country in the militarized West, from the 2010s to the 1940s, and then back to the 1860s before returning to the present. And my primary goal is to convince you that the Nevada desert, first of all, has never been a wasteland, by showing you how it has always been critically important to those who have depended on its resources for their lives and livelihoods, whether that's the NUMU, the NUA, or workers and executives at Lithium Nevada LLC. Ironically, however, by calling its minerals, critical in the sort of extractive or militarized sense, I want to suggest that we run the risk of making it into a wasteland. Indeed, some of the most critical militarized landscapes in the West are those that have been cordoned off from public use and designated as sort of permanent wastelands, right? Despite existing technically on public federal lands, places like the Nevada test site, which hosted 40 years of atomic weapons testing, making the land all but uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. Now, I call it the militarized West because it has often been the international geopolitics of conflict and competition which have set the terms for Western land use. In both the long history of mineral extraction and the more recent development of such massive bombing ranges on federal land, either managed exclusively by the Department of Defense or co-managed with a number of civilian land management agencies, usually the Bureau of Land Management. So this is a different story of public lands than we're used to. Thus, what I hope to show in my book is that if we define militarization sort of broadly as being subject to military imperatives and incentive structures, and if we consider the many different forms that militarization has taken on the federal public lands that dominate the American West, we can see that the region has kind of always been militarized to varying degrees. Now, historians have highlighted the way that World War II supercharged urban development in places like San Francisco, Seattle, Long Beach, Anchorage, and other West Coast cities. Looking at the dramatic increase in population alone, they characterize this wartime boom as a sort of watershed moment in the history of the West, right? But what I'm trying to show is that the World War II boom was much more widespread and led to both rural growth and urbanization. So Las Vegas, for example, saw tremendous growth, of course, in the early 1940s, but there was a much larger sort of landscape going on around it. And further, I want to suggest that the history of the militarized West is not so much one of rapid change as one of sort of long-term continuity with moments of dynamic transformation, or as one historian recently put it, World War II was more like a Western water project than a watershed, in that it captured, redirected, and sort of accelerated older flows and put them to new purposes. Now, from the founding of the Republic, the U.S. Armed Forces, the Army, later the Navy, and after it was established in 1947, the Air Force, have played a central role in setting and achieving ostensibly domestic priorities, particularly when it's involved public lands and natural resources. But what has changed, however, is sort of the nature of military involvement. So let's start in the 20th century and let's work our way back to the context of the massacre at Pahimaham. So the language of minerals as critical to the nation is an invention of World War II mobilization period, as you might have guessed. The turn of phrase and official bureaucratic category was actually codified in a 1939 piece of legislation called the Strategic and Critical Materials Stockpiling Act, which has been updated to account for newly critical minerals in the 1950s, 1970s, and again in the 2010s. In this way, the wartime language of crisis, which is at the root of critical, has framed the conversation about the stakes and goals of extraction throughout the 20th century, whether for lithium, titanium, uranium, or as I look at in my work, the so-called miracle metal magnesium, which was a short-lived industry which supercharged growth in central and southern Nevada between 1941 and 1943. Now, categorizing magnesium as strategic and critical in the Stockpiling Act, specifically for its application as a light metal alternative to aluminum in aeronautics and munitions manufacturing, it sort of legitimized the expedient development of new open pit mines, trucking highways, and aircraft plants, as well as one of the largest petrochemical manufacturing plants, one of the largest electrochemical factories in the world just south of Las Vegas in Henderson, Nevada. Like with lithium, Nevada's leaders, such as the Senator Pat McCarran, who you see on the left, envisioned an entirely in-house supply chain to replace America's reliance on foreign sources at a time of rising international tension. The biggest selling point for critical mineral boosters like McCarran, besides the unique availability of magnesite ore in west central Nevada, was having unprecedented access to Colorado River water and hydroelectricity from Hoover Dam, which was then known as Boulder Dam due to Herbert Hoover's unpopularity during the New Deal period. Now, when the basic magnesium factory, which you see down here, was up and running in 1942, it guzzled 37 million gallons of water every day, pumped through an 18-mile pipeline from the reservoir to the factory built specifically for the purpose. At full operation in 1943, the plant's consumption of electricity amounted to 1.5 billion kilowatt hours, which apparently, according to the Secretary of Commerce, Jesse Jones, was equivalent to the amount of electricity used annually in the states of Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico combined. Manufacturers benefited as well from proximity to the thriving aviation economy of Southern California, home to major Army and Navy contractors such as Douglas Aircraft Company and Northrop. So, as I've discovered in oral histories and local memoirs, however, the proceeds generated by the plant operator Basic Magnesium were distributed unevenly among longtime residents and newcomers, often splitting along racial, ethnic, and pre-existing class lines. For example, while Basic got access to all this water from Lake Mead because of its critical importance to the war effort, the Las Vegas Valley, in fact, still relied on groundwater, as it would until the early 1950s. In 1942, just as the Basic factory went operational, the influx of the workers and their families catalyzed Southern Nevada's first major water crisis, in addition to a desperate housing shortage. Artisanal wells ran dry across the valley, and informal neighborhoods of plywood, scrap metal, and surplus canvas appeared all along the Boulder Highway between Las Vegas and Henderson. But water scarcity and exorbitant rents were experienced first and foremost in African American communities across the railroad tracks in West Las Vegas and at the Las Vegas Indian Colony, a small state-recognized reservation just north of downtown. So founded in 1911, the colony is home to several dozen Southern Paiute families who once farmed in valleys north of the Colorado River using sophisticated irrigation methods developed over the centuries, that is, until settlers displaced them. In their oral traditions, Southern Paiutes, or Nuwuvi as they call themselves, celebrate the preponderance of seeps and springs that were once found throughout Las Vegas, which in Spanish actually translates to the meadows. But with the advent of critical mineral production, as well as the establishment of the Las Vegas Army Airfield on the north side of town, which is now Nellis Air Force Base, they found themselves dispossessed of a resource that has always been central to their lifeways and culture: water. Now, at the same time that critical minerals can trace their kind of discursive, their linguistic and bureaucratic roots to the Second World War, the process of locating, claiming, and developing the mines, which takes place almost entirely on public lands in the American West, operates within legal frameworks erected not in the 1940s, but in the 1860s. So now let's turn to that moment. So it's a little messy of a map, but throughout the 19th century, the War Department oversaw westward expansion, including during the time of the Thacker Pass massacre. The Army's operations had an explicitly spatial component, as we can see in this map from 1873, which shows, if you can see them, forts or camps, as they would call them sometimes, as well as Indian reservations, surveyed land, which is marked by the grid, and railroad tracks. By in effect segregating the land into zones for extraction and Indian reservations, cavalry troops helped clear it of indigenous people and their claims to the resources that Americans coveted. The massacre at Pahimah shows that they were not always successful at separating settlers and native communities, of course, but that dispossession happened regardless, and often through this sort of paramilitary violence. So now the date of the massacre itself, September 12th, 1865, fell squarely between two of what are the most really important years in the history of the West in general, I think, and the history of Nevada in particular. On the first of those dates, October 31st, 1864, after 3 booming years as a territory, Congress actually made Nevada a state, albeit with a population of roughly 40,000 people, well below the threshold of 60,000, which was recommended in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. But as many an AP US history student could tell you, Nevada gained statehood so rapidly because of the Comstock load silver rush, which kicked off in the fall of 1859. Now, there's a reason why another nickname for Nevada, besides Battleborn, is the Silver State. And believe it or not, this map down here was actually the flag down here was actually the state flag from 1905 to 1950. A little garish, in my opinion, but we'll leave it to them. So, except for a handful of scattered ranches, centers of trade like Carson City, and after 1869, of course, railroad hubs like Reno, 19th century Nevada depended almost entirely on silver, and to a lesser extent, gold, and some other metals. Indeed, mining dominated the economy until really the 1930s, with booms and busts punctuating the extractive era, until diversification into tourism, casinos, and defense industries proper leveled out these sort of wild swings that they experienced. Thus, despite the boom in mining during World War II, magnesium wasn't a monopoly the way that silver was. For at least the first 60 years or 70 years as a state, all of Nevada's secondary industries served mining districts in one way or another, producing food, milling ore, and shipping bullion to market. The state's fortunes rose and fell with the price of silver. It was the Battleborn state's original critical mineral, if you will. So unsurprisingly, when it gained statehood, Nevada sent a congressional delegation to Washington that would represent the interests of silver producers. In late February 1865, the most powerful member of this delegation, the wealthy attorney, mine investor, and now appointed senator, William Morris Stewart, arrived in D.C. with one goal in mind, which was to pass legislation which would grant prospectors and mining companies complete, unfettered, and untaxed access to the public domain for mining. It took a year of maneuvering on Capitol Hill to secure such lenient provisions, despite the best efforts of Eastern lawmakers who wanted to reap royalties, as you might expect, from the minerals that were being produced on federal property. But on July 26, 1866, the other important date from the map, or from the chart right there, if you'll remember, the first iteration of the General Mining Act was signed into law by President Andrew Johnson. So, in effect, the General Mining Act, which you may be familiar with, codified the sort of haphazard, bespoke system of on the ground claims making, which grew organically out of local conditions during the California Gold Rush. In the 1850s, with the federal government preoccupied by other questions, conflicts, and rebellions, Congress essentially left California's prospectors to their own devices and left questions about mineral property rights to the California legislature and state Supreme Court. Now, overwhelmed by the sheer number of miners and the limits of such a young state government to oversee the rush, state leaders deferred to miners themselves, who gathered into little assemblies and drew up codes, miners' codes, for new districts that they themselves presided over. Miners' codes granted enormous leeway to those who got there first, with the express purpose of moving ore to market through whatever technological means necessary. It was the birth of what has come to be called prior appropriation resource law. Now, the doctrine of prior appropriation today is best known as the standard by which state governments adjudicate water rights in arid parts of the country, but it actually began as a core principle of local norms among California's placer miners, something I learned in my research that I didn't know. And by the time prospectors began moving over the mountains from California into what was then Western Utah territory, a common miners' code had become accepted as the standard, which was based on the 1852 Assembly at Nevada County, California, chaired by this guy, William Stewart. Now, Stewart eventually moved to Virginia City amid the Comstock Rush in 1859, which was really the heart of the action. And when he became senator in 1865, he imported many of the ideas about mineral property rights that he had helped design and implement himself during his years in Nevada County, California. The General Mining Act, which is also known as the Stewart Act, because he wrote and introduced it in the Senate, it gave everyone, whether you're a citizen or not, the right to quite literally stake a claim in the ground and demarcate property in real time. It also authorized construction of infrastructure on the public domain at a massive scale if builders had the funds and the needs to do so. This included adjacent land for factories or for reservoirs, and rights of way for canals or railroad spur lines. In fact, the title of the 1866 bill, which was only strengthened in the more well-known 1872 version, betrayed this quality as an infrastructure bill, is really what it was. Its official name was an act granting the right of way to ditch and canal owners of the public lands and for other purposes. Yet those other purposes were laid bare in the law's first section, which reads, "Be it enacted that the mineral lands of the public domain, both surveyed and unsurveyed, are hereby declared to be free and open to exploration and occupation." Also laid bare were the bill's roots in this sort of organic, extractive, settler community environment that I just described, as its provisions were, quote, subject to the local customs or rules of miners in the several mining districts of the US. Now, of course, the General Mining Act failed to mention the fact that much of the unsurveyed public domain lands that it declared free and open were already occupied by indigenous people, such as the Northern Paiute. Now, as students of history today, or I guess budding mineral property lawyers, we could consider ourselves, it's essential to understand the General Mining Act as really a legal artifact which emerged out of this particular context, this tumultuous, violent, and highly contingent or uncertain moment in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, when the very continued existence of the nation itself was an open question. The time of William Stewart's greatest influence over public land administration, we should remember, was well before the rise of progressive era conservation laws, which did things like establish national parks and national forests, or much later, the environmental policies of the mid 20th century, which mandated things like environmental reviews or set pollution standards. Stewart's time was defined essentially by a smash and grab outlook among many wealthy investors and developers, Stewart included. With little to no formal guidance on land policy and minimal law enforcement in any event, it was a time of hasty, almost frantic property formation, as well as rampant trespassing and widespread dispossession, as well as extermination campaigns against Native people throughout California, Oregon, Nevada, and really anywhere that mining districts were popping up. So recently, the historians whose books you see here, Benjamin Madley and Boyd Cothran, among others, have chronicled these brutal waves of violence against Indigenous Californians, which often closely followed the formation of new mining districts such as Wairika in Siskiyou County and Jacksonville in Jackson County, Oregon. Now, in the case of the Comstock Silver Rush, the wave of violence that cleared the way for extraction was the Pyramid Lake War in the spring of 1860. Now, following a brutally cold winter, tensions exploded between the so-called Old Californians in Virginia City, Nevada, recently departed from their old state once the gold rush began to go bust, and their northern Paiute neighbors at Pyramid Lake, about 30 miles to the north. Although Paiute fighters led by Numaga achieved an early victory against disorganized American militia, they eventually were defeated by Army reinforcements sent from San Francisco. After the conflict, Paiutes were sequestered on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation, which had been established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs the previous year, with the goal of actually keeping settlers off of native property, to reserve a protected plot of land from settler encroachment. But what was supposed to be a sanctuary for the native people now felt more like a prison under War Department and BIA supervision. In July 1860, the U.S. Army began construction of Fort Churchill, a cavalry post stationed just downhill from Virginia City on the Carson River, staffed with soldiers who would oversee the Paiutes, many of whom had actually fled into the desert north and east of the mining district. Fort Churchill, as you can see sort of in this map, again a little blurry, but it sat strategically on the Comstock's eastern flank, halfway between Pyramid Lake Reservation to the north and its twin reservation in the south, which was home to the Walker River Paiute tribe. During the Civil War, which broke out actually just a few months after the establishment of Fort Churchill, Army infrastructure throughout the West languished. This presented opportunities for Native people to kind of reassert their claim to territory through violence of their own. Periodic uprisings flared throughout the Nevada Territory in 1862 and 1863. With few military resources to contain the insurgent tribes, the federal government turned to diplomacy. So in 1863, the U.S. Indian agent James Duane Doty traveled to the border of Utah and Nevada, where he signed the Treaty of Ruby Valley with the western bands of the Shoshone Nation of Indians, represented by their chiefs and principal men and warriors. This, quote, treaty of peace and friendship ceded no land to the United States and explicitly recognized the land as Shoshone country. Instead of the transfer of territory, which Doty was really not in a position to negotiate in any event, the Treaty of Ruby Valley only preserved a right-of-way easement along several routes of travel through the Shoshone country, now or hereafter used by white men. Importantly, however, it also granted that, quote, military posts may be established along said routes or elsewhere in their country, and, quote, it's further agreed that the Shoshone country may be explored and prospected for gold and silver or for other minerals, and when mines are discovered, they may be worked, and mining and agricultural settlements formed, and ranches established wherever they may be required. It goes on. Mills may be erected and timber taken for their use, as also for building and other purposes in any part of the country claimed by said bands, the Shoshones. In other words, it made allowances for the infrastructure of this emerging mineral empire, the bones of militarized mineral extraction, production, and shipping that was so critical to this nation that was at war. So when the Civil War ended, the War Department found funding to exercise this right to build infrastructure in Shoshone and Paiute country, much of it from the very proceeds of mining itself, which had pumped the US Treasury full of silver and gold bullion for coinage. One of the post-war government's first projects in the unsettled Western interior was construction of Fort McDermott on the border of Nevada and Oregon. There, cavalry were directed to keep the peace, which had fractured, of course, in the intervening years. But in reality, they were stationed primarily to protect local Paiutes again from reprisals of prospectors and ranchers in the area. During the war, without the soldiers to mediate, settler civilians had returned to the practice of putting down Indian rebellions on their own, eager to settle the country for the lucrative business of mineral production. White militias terrorized native communities throughout the Great Basin who fought back by reorganizing into militant bands of their own. But when they did, or even if just rumors were flying about the possibility that they might, militia members leveraged local fears to underwrite acts of blatant extermination. The attack on the Paiutes at Thacker Pass followed this common pattern. The most complete written account of the events actually comes from the autobiography of Big Bill Haywood, who was the prolific miner, labor organizer, and leader of the IWW, who was born in Salt Lake City and actually lived in southern Idaho and northern Nevada in the 1880s and 90s. He says, quote, "The story of the massacre of the Paiute Indians at Thacker Pass was told to me first by Jim Sackett, one of the volunteers who took part in the killing. I also heard the story from Ox Sam, a Paiute who had made his escape, one of only 3 survivors. Sackett's story, quote, began with an explanation of the many depredations on the part of the Indians throughout southern Oregon and northern Nevada, which caused the white men to organize a volunteer company, which he said was for mutual protection. This company had been famous as the crack Indian fighters of that section, Big Bill Haywood says, and their quarters were at Fort McDermott. From this base, they scoured the countryside looking for Indians. Now, the morning of the massacre, the group stumbled upon a camp at Thacker Pass. Catching the sleeping Paiutes by surprise, they went, quote, from one wickiup to another, pouring in our bullets, Sackett boasted. Those of the Indians who were only wounded, he continued, we put out of their misery and then rode away, with another member of the militia, Charlie Thacker, carrying 2 papooses behind him, by which he meant orphaned Paiute babies. These young ones then grew to manhood and were known as Jim and Charlie Thacker Jr. So in other words, Thacker Pass today still carries the name of one of the perpetrators of the massacre at Bahemaha. And what is more, this man, Charlie Thacker, the self-described Indian hunter, took it upon himself to forcibly adopt 2 of the 3 Paiute survivors and give them his name. So months after this conversation with Sackett, Haywood asked the 3rd survivor, Ox Sam, about the incident. He said, quote, that's pretty bad time, he said. Soldier hunt Paiute just like coyote. That's the time of Thacker Pass. Lots of Indians were going to Quinn River to get ducks, goose. That morning, soldier come quick, shoot, shoot. Now last year, Protect Thacker Pass established a camp just outside of Bahemaha to block the path of a proposed pipeline, which would supply the lithium mine with water, as authorized under the 1872 General Mining Act. Members of the resistance group named it Ox Sam Camp in honor of this survivor, to whom some in the group still trace their ancestry. So, in all of my work as an environmental historian, which is kind of how I describe myself usually, I try to ask critical questions about the language that we use to describe, categorize, and administer the land. What makes a resource critical? And what makes the land a wasteland? I'm particularly interested in places like Thacker Pass and the broader Desert Southwest more broadly, where systems of value, native and settler values, national and local values, military and civilian values, collide when outside incentives for development change dramatically. Only by unpacking the interests involved can we get at the structures of power that layer these landscapes like Bahima. Critical to whom and for what? Wasted in what sense? So in a 2015 book about the legacies of uranium mining in Navajo country, which I highly recommend, the environmental historian Tracy Bryn Voiles wrote that, quote, the social construction of the high, this is a little theoretical, but social construction of the high arid landscapes of the Southwest as more or less worthless has been a fundamental component of colonization of the Diné or Navajo, as well as other Southwestern and Great Basin tribes. In fact, she goes on, the inhabitation of dry, arid landscapes by native nations was actually used as evidence of their low status on the Western hierarchy of civilization, following a kind of environmental determinism that posited that barren landscapes supported villainous and savage peoples. Now, Voiles calls this wastelanded. That's why the title of her book is Wastelanding. Describing lands as wasted legitimized their dispossession from indigenous peoples who, settlers imagined, could never improve the desert according to Americans' imported notions of political and economic development or beauty and morality. When settlers learned that even they were unable to make the desert bloom through irrigation, they then wrote off the land as marginal, leaving it open to more physical forms of wastelanding by means of extraction, pollution, and sometimes just outright destruction as bombing ranges, right? So Voiles' framing of history in the Desert Southwest has been influential in this way on my thinking throughout my research and writing of my book. As you'll notice, it inspired the name of the talk, which comes from the title actually of my dissertation, which I just finished last year. But after spending the past 5 years on this project, I think 6 years now actually, and watching the events at Thacker Pass unfold from afar, I'm not entirely sure I agree with Tracy Voiles' way of describing and theorizing the history of America's deserts, whether they're in Arizona, Nevada, or wherever else they might be considered a wasteland. For one, like I said at the outset, deserts aren't wastelands. Anyone can see that if they visit one. And I don't think that Tracy would disagree with me. Indeed, deserts are critically important ecosystems that have supported human populations for thousands of years. And I can say from my own experiences in the field, driving between archives, camping under its cloudless skies, and getting to know the place by just being there on the land. Nevada is a stunning, beautiful place, and the people who live there wouldn't trade it for the world. So by placing the history of such manufactured wastelands as the Nevada Test Site, or as it's been called since 2010, the Nevada National Security Site, alongside this long history of critical mineral mining that I've sketched today, we can see that Voiles' declensionist notion of wastelanding, which is to say her description of this history as being primarily about decline and destruction, it kind of only gets us halfway to understanding what it's like there. Lands that were once considered wastelands, such as the Quinn River watershed, are now in fact being called critical. And indigenous people who were once relegated to the margins of the desert now find themselves actually defending those very marginal landscapes from new urgent interests in their homelands. So regardless of what we call those lands, however, the legal infrastructure of the General Mining Act, the Stewart Act, remember, was erected to exploit the deserts, mountains, and forests where critical minerals are found. And it remains the law on public lands really across the West, despite repeated attempts to repeal and replace it with something more democratic, environmentally friendly, and subject to formal requirements for government to government consultation with the tribes. So, how might we, as people who are ostensibly committed to addressing the climate crisis for our health and that of the planet, how might we reconcile the urgency of the moment that we live in with this painful historical reality? That critical mineral mining stands to make wastelands not unlike those created in the past during more overtly colonial booms in mineral extraction. Now, to be sure, soldiers no longer patrol the Great Basin in the same way that they did in the 19th century, and fortunately, the last Indian massacres ended in the early 20th century. But to quote one Western Shoshone tribal member in a March 1964 letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, quote, "There's no longer any need to shoot down Indians in order to take away their rights and their lands. Legislation, the courts, and the Indian Bureau do the trick legally." So to close my presentation, I'd like to suggest that we might begin, first of all, by really listening to the Numu land defenders at Protect Thacker Pass and valuing their priorities. For Northern Paiute people, the most critical resource of all is water, a fact that demonstrators highlight in their press releases and their actions. So last year, for example, the group constructed a camp in the path of a water pipeline, again, intended to supply the lithium mine with millions of gallons pumped from precious aquifers, which the Numu consider sacred. Indeed, water is so critical to their worldview that it can be found in the name Paiute itself. Pa, in Numic languages like Paiute and Shoshone, signifies the material and really the metaphysical power of water, thus Paiute. What would it take for water to be thought of and categorized as critical to the nation? I'm not sure I have that answer to that question today. But I hope that in this talk, I've given you tools to think about that question historically. Or at the very least, I hope that I've convinced you that the desert is not a barren wasteland. First and foremost, it's a homeland. And we should treat it that way, whether we live there or not. So thanks for listening. All right, well, I welcome any questions.
What's going on today?
It's a good question. And this is something that,
Could you repeat the question?
what's going on today with Protect Thacker Pass so last that I read about it earlier this summer, there had been an injunction against the group, the Protect Thacker Pass group. And they had to be dispersed from the land because under the General Mining Act, Nevada Lithium LLC's claim was valid. From what I understand, the group is still appealing, but like I said at the beginning, I haven't really followed up on this question since about the early summer. So next phase of my book project is I think I'm going to return to that question and see where we go from here. Yeah, but it's an ongoing issue. Yeah.
Our situation here in Alaska is a little bit different than Nevada.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much time you've been up here, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, the natives, Indians, I guess you could use the term for them, but you know, the Native Alaskans have been an active participant in the mining developments that we've had here in Alaska. And ongoing exploration is certainly incorporating them into the whole process.
Yeah. So I mean that's an excellent point.
I think it's fine.
Yeah, and I'm interested to know more because this was one of the things that surprised me, I guess, when I came up here but the more that Native Alaskan corporations, Alaska Native corporations, are invested.
Oh, they're
in mining.
the main owners of a couple of the major mines.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that's one of the things that, as I've learned more about kind of the complexities of natural resource extraction, particularly in a state where the laws that administer not just public lands, but tribal lands are very different. And so I think one of the, I don't know if solutions is the right word, but one of the ways of navigating this issue of kind of distributing the proceeds from mining more equitably is to give tribal nations down in Nevada a stake in these mines. At the same time, I think that would complicate the issue around who gets to claim which mines. Because I imagine that while certain tribes would say that Thacker Pass falls within their jurisdiction, other tribes might have a difference of opinion. So a lot of it comes
You're
down.
setting off competition between the tribes.
Exactly. So it's like I said, there are similarities and differences between a place like Alaska and Nevada, and they're intriguing to think about, right? Both historically and presently. You know, the potential for making a more kind of, again, equitable space for development.
Well, I'd like to think that we learned from some of our mistakes
Mm-hmm.
and doing better today.
Yeah.
Well, at least speaking for Alaska.
Right. And I like to think so too. And that's kind of why I try to place emphasis on the laws that are still kind of on the books. And I know that like the General Mining Act is one of these statutes that is almost considered sacrosanct in some Western, politicians' minds, basically. You know, it's a product of the traditions of the mining groups and that sort of thing. But I think it's a type of law that doesn't fit with the current type of mining that goes on, for one. And it also it's been grandfathered in with a lot of these kind of environmental regulations that.
You're speaking of the mining law as it stands.
What's that?
The mining law as it presently stands.
The General Mining Act. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's intriguing to think about for sure.
Well, I see it working better now than it did 10 years ago and better than it did 20 years ago.
That's great. Yeah.
But I think overall it's as good of a law code as you could expect to have.
Yeah. All right. Well, I welcome other questions. Or
Do you know anything about Fremont? There's a fairly large city in the Bay Area named Fremont.
Yeah.
And then he ended up being court-martialed, but he was with some pretty rough people. A guy named Pettis from down in Louisiana, and a few of these other people, and it's not well known. It's not well known all his activities out there. Got out there, but he would be suspected of possibly massacres as well, I would think. There's certain groups that were really well established that disappeared. The Chumash. There was a very old settlement, like the Hopis.
Right. If you, so for those of you who aren't familiar, Fremont is John Charles Fremont, explorer, first senator from the state of California, instrumental in creating what was called the Bear Republic, this brief period in California's history. But yeah, so he has seen a recent sort of reevaluation among many historians along the lines of what this gentleman is saying here, that he was likely involved in a number of massacres or kind of periods of rapid extermination. I'm not as familiar with this story, although it sounds like you know a lot about it.
Well, I believe it's kind of indirect because a lot of it was covered up.
Right.
And the New Englanders, people like Thoreau had some kind of inclination of what was going on, but they ended up court-martialing him, but then he reinstated himself in the Civil War and got promoted and ended up, like you said, in the senator and all that.
Well, and he's a figure that, I mean, what you're talking about here, that the evidence of his actions, much of it was kind of concealed by higher ups because it wasn't a great look, even though it was kind of part and parcel of what was going on in the West.
Well, Fremont had very influential connection.
Mm-hmm.
A guy named uh, Benson in Missouri
Mm-hmm.
was
Right.
Senate, and
Yeah.
he was very he was hooked up, and that's kind of what got him off. But
right. Well, if you're interested, any of you are interested in this particular story, and the kind of California experience, which comes just a few years before what I was talking about with Nevada. Uh, these two books, but especially the one on the left here, by a historian down at UCLA named Benjamin Madley, really do a remarkable job of finding evidence of that. I don't know how much in this book is about Fremont in particular, but there's a lot of documentation of the way that the state of California's leaders sanctioned the violence. They either posted bounties for dead Native people, or they provided resources to them, or they looked the other way.
And it wasn't even just them. California has a history, Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of lynchings.
Yep. It's all wrapped up in this period of violence that is really what I'm talking
Vigilante
about here.
Committee in San Francisco.
Yeah.
You looked at one of those people the wrong way.
Yeah. No, it was a when people talk about the Wild West, there are these kind of fantastic mythical depictions that we think of, but really in reality, there was a lack of law enforcement in many of these places, or there was a form of law enforcement that sort of condoned or looked the other way, or sometimes actively participated in it as well. So this book in particular was instrumental in just the past couple of years. It was the governor of the state, Gavin Newsom. He sat down with a number of tribal leaders and used the G word, used the word genocide to describe it, and that was kind of the first on the record moment of that language being used, and even proposing sort of a truth and reconciliation committee, not unlike the one that went on in Canada a few years ago. So fascinating story, many facets that still need to be uncovered. Kathy?
Thank you. So it's a conundrum for me now because I'm thinking the next car I'm going to buy, right, is that right, an e-vehicle,
Yeah.
and I'm going to power it up here, so it's hydropower. This is going to be great.
And it will. And it will be.
It will be.
It will be.
Because how are we going to ethically extract lithium? Are we going to let other countries do it? Say, oh well.
So this is why I say I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a forecaster. I'm merely a historian. And I think, again, going kind of back to the laws, I think there's no doubt that there's a need for extracting whatever resources are necessary for this manufacturing boom. And you're right. I think that it should be located where Americans can perform those jobs, can make money off of this critical mineral boom. It should not be going to other countries. So I agree with that kind of component of it. But I think, again, there needs to be a larger conversation about kind of all layers of the process of building the supply chain for it. Where are the resources, where the federal dollar is going to be coming from, how much are we going to have kind of public ownership over those factories that are turning the raw ore into milled products. It's a question that invites a conversation that I don't think is really happening outside of a place like Nevada or outside of a place like Alaska to a certain extent. So I think it's what I'm trying to do with this project is not so much say EVs are bad or something like that, because I know my next car is probably going to be an EV too. It just makes sense. But what I'm saying is that below the surface of this language in particular, this language that trades in emergency and crisis and in all of these things that these words that set off alarm bells in us and make us think of wartime efforts, right? They kind of push aside all of the questions that might be asked about why we're doing it, how fast we're doing it, who gets to participate, etc. I think we need to slow down a little bit, which, for better or for worse, is kind of happening right now, with both the economy and the kind of political situation. Take a second to have a wider discussion about how the lithium mining industry fits into the bigger picture of becoming, as we should be, the leaders in the electric vehicle revolution. So that's not mine to do, but I'll put that out there. So
The water that's used in producing lithium, is it then just worthless water? Is it polluted? Is it? I mean, that's shocking to use that much water.
right, what happens to the wastewater?
And
Yeah.
and where I mean that's part of a. Everybody needs water in that part of the country, right?
Right. Yeah. What happens to the wastewater?
And is
Yeah.
it wastewater, and it will always be wastewater, or?
So it depends on the type of mining that's going on. So I showed you an image. So, well, for example, I mean, this is magnesium, so not lithium, but another kind of manufacturing milling process. The wastewater from here went right back into into the reservoir, went right back into Lake Mead. But that was because there weren't the environmental restrictions on where it could go after that. So there was concerns about kind of channeling the water away from residences and whatever, but that was about as far as it went. Now, there it is. This is a lithium evaporation pool or complex. And so this water just evaporates up out of the slurry or whatever. This is where I'm at the limits of my technical knowledge here. But so that water evaporates and then wherever it goes from there. Some of it, I mean, they're supposed to be lined with plastic or something like that to keep it from seeping through. But I think, to redirect your question a little bit, the concern among many of the impacted communities, both native and non-native, is about what we don't know about the processes. If the water does escape into the ground, where does it then go? Right? And groundwater research, what is it called? Geohydrology or something like that. That is something that scientists are still understanding the kind of flow patterns, especially in an arid drainage basin like this, where the water flows to. So those are three sort of answers to your question, but it's a good one because water is essential in all cycles of its life in the desert, so to speak. And so there are traditions of reusing wastewater in native communities as well. So again, I don't know, but yeah.
You're aware of the controversy about the mines in Canada to affect the rivers that come into Alaska.
So that was that was the news story that I showed at the beginning here. Yeah.
Where is that one located?
So that one's called Silver Peak, and it's like south of Reno, basically, about 100 miles or so. Yeah.
I probably missed this, but how much federal land is in Nevada? And you haven't,
Yeah.
they haven't a settlement land claim settlement act having happened.
Yes, exactly. So this is the question about kind of native stake in, right. So that's actually Nevada has more federal public land than Alaska does. It has like 80% of its land base is federal public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And that's in part because of this history of...
It was the case here until the Native Land Claims Settlement Act came through, and then they gave a big chunk of that acreage off to the native groups.
Right. But they haven't done that. Yeah.
So that's the issue, is that actually many of the tribes down in Nevada are saying and have been saying for basically since that treaty that I cited there, since 1863, saying we never ceded the land to y'all. Similar to kind of how tribes up here did not cede the land to the United States in the Statehood Act or anything like that. And so we want, at the very least, if we're not going to get our land back, we want compensation for it. And there have been trials. There have been court cases in the mid 20th century. That's a whole can of worms to get into. But
Excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
Are you speaking of Nevada?
I'm speaking of Nevada.
Specifically
Yeah.
Nevada.
So before the ANCSA or ANILCA, before the land claim settlement, yeah, before that, these tribes down in Nevada had started their own land claims processes, but there wasn't the push for federal congressional legislation the way that there was for Alaska in the 1970s.
Do you know about what the percentage of indigenous population is there in the state of relative to Alaska?
Oh, it's much smaller,
Much
for sure. Yeah, it's smaller in terms of proportional and total size. And again, this is both a product of the history of kind of displacement of Native people in Nevada. Many of them moved to cities. That's why actually Las Vegas has an urban reservation right in the middle of it, is that when these mining booms happened, tribal members dispersed to where the economy was. They moved to Las Vegas or to Virginia City or whatever. So it's hard to say the relationship between the kind of historic population and the contemporary population, except that there's also another factor involved, which is that the environment of Nevada doesn't support the level of population.
So
that
there's
would
no, in the Four Corners area, there's, thousands of sheep on the res, and there's, but
Navajo.
what's on the res in Nevada? So there's nothing to support them.
So here's another can of worms, but Nevada doesn't have the same sort of large scale reservation geography that there is in a place like Arizona or Utah or Idaho. And again, it's partly because of this history of displacement. That's why this reservation in Las Vegas, tribal member numbers are in the dozens or hundreds. So there's that aspect of it. And then for a long time, because of that displacement, because of what the federal leaders were seeing, Indian agents were seeing as this kind of incoherence of the tribe, they decided not to federally recognize them for a long time.
That was my next question. Are they federally recognized?
Yeah. So again, another can of worms, but that's why there are so many tribal nations in Nevada, is because after that period of dispersal, after that period of non-recognition, then in the 1930s, during a period of what was called the Indian New Deal, there was a law that was passed that basically allowed for non-recognized tribes to form new tribes that would be recognized. And many different bands of Western Shoshone and Southern and Northern Paiutes all around the state decided to do that with their own families, essentially. And so that's why you have all these kind of smaller communities spread out throughout the state. There isn't the coherence or the kind of corporate private investment factor that there is up here as well. So it's complicated, I guess, is the long and short of it. Yeah. Well, any other questions? I know we're a little over at this point, so